the South Pacific. Okay, let me start it again. So in 2019, 27 law students from the University of the South Pacific began advocating for the leaders of their countries to seek an advisory opinion on climate change from the ICJ, and then in subsequent years, over a span of next 6 years, this process continued. In 2021, Vanuatu took up the campaign and drove the initiative together with many other governments. And then in 2023, the United Nations General Assembly passed a unanimous resolution requesting the ICJ to issue an advisory opinion on climate change. And the two questions that were posed were: what are the legal obligations of states under international law to ensure the protection of the climate system and the environment from greenhouse gas emissions for both the present and the future generations? And then, what are the legal consequences for states where they have caused significant harm to the climate system and other parts of the environment with respect to states, particularly SIDS, and people from both present and future generations affected by the adverse effects of the ongoing climate crisis? So, and then in 2024, these proceedings began with 91 submissions and ultimately concluded a few weeks ago with that historic decision. So, why are we hosting this webinar? We are basically hosting this webinar as also a platform to build capacity for the movement to understand and unpack what were the key parts of the advisory opinion, and then what does it mean for our movements, for the climate justice organizations that organize on the ground and that are leading a lot of these fights with their communities at national, regional, and global level. And then what do some of our strategies look like, not just at national or regional level, but also at within the international climate policy spaces like UNFCCC. So with that, I'll hand it over to our first speaker. Please welcome, please welcome Liddy Nakpil. She is an activist working on economic, environmental, debt, tax, social, and gender justice issues at national, regional, and global levels. She's the coordinator of Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, and also a member of the coordinating committee of DCJ, as well as several other networks like Global Alliance on Tax Justice, Philippine Movement for Climate Justice, and Freedom from Debt Coalition. Liddy, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, and a good evening to everyone. First, my co-panelists, I'm very honored to be joining you in this evening to share thoughts on the significance of the ICJ advisory opinion and what are for the assigned topics to me, what are the most relevant provisions in the opinion. And also a greeting to all of those participating. And it's quite a big number of people joining us tonight. So that's a big thank you to the work of Esta and Rachita in preparing for this webinar. So I'd just like to share my slides, if that's okay, just to be able to emphasize these provisions that is very important for all of us. So first, it is very gratifying that the ICJ opinion is actually advisory opinion is actually stating very clearly what we have as climate justice movements have been saying for so many years and have been demanding, because we have also been basing our demands not just simply from our own perspective of what is just and what is fair and what is urgent, but this is also based on what the governments around the world have actually agreed, under many different agreements, the climate change agreements. So the advisory opinion refers to obligations of states under the climate change treaties. And they're referring to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. And we have also always said that these are obligations that are binding, legally binding, and that the advisory opinion is actually verifying and confirming our own understanding that these are legally binding obligations. But it's not just referring to the climate change treaties, no? It's also referring to what is called customary international law. Uh, and so we're not just invoking a set of treaties that is specifically about climate. We're also invoking the advisory opinion is also referring to customary international laws. So these laws are restating that there are obligations of the state to ensure the protection of the climate system and the environment. The other part of that opinion is also referring to other relevant obligations of states. So they proceeded to mention at least 6 other obligations of states that are contained in various conventions, protocols, treaties. So I'm not going to read this for the sake of time. It's all showed on the screen. And I'd also like to encourage everyone to, if the actual AO is more than 130 pages, you can also read the summary. It's a quite shorter document. So they're very clear on this obligation of states. Now, for the principles that for us have really strong resonance that they invoked in this, first, there is that principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. It's very, very important, especially at this time, for the AO to reiterate and emphasize this principle because, as we know, for many years now, we have been struggling against the efforts of the rich, wealthy countries who have more responsibilities for climate change, the biggest, and therefore have the biggest share of obligations, very clear obligations, not just to do climate action within their territories, but also internationally, because their obligations, responsibilities, and obligations are huge. And this principle is very much being emphasized and reiterated in the advisory opinion. So that is really very important for us especially at this time. There's that effort to water down this principle by these rich, wealthy countries for many, many years now. In terms of another principle that also resonates very strongly with climate justice movements is the principle of equity. And on the relevant paragraphs of the advisory opinion, they are also referring to previous decisions of the ICJ that affirms that equity is a legal concept that is a direct emanation of the idea of justice. And I quote their words. And the legal concept of equity is a general principle directly applicable as law. So that's very strong words for affirming the principle of equity as very, not only very relevant, but is at the core of the obligations of states. Now, I was asked to say something about how climate finance and means of implementation is also covered in the advisory opinion. And I just, there's strengthening of this point about climate finance obligations in various sections, but I just like to quote these 2 particular sections of the advisory opinion that when taken together is very clear, and we have always used this as the basis for invoking that climate finance is part of the responsibility and obligation, and that this is also based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. So there's this particular, again, reiteration of the principle of CBDR, as we call it for short, common but differentiated responsibilities. And very clearly, it mentioned the obligations of technology and financial transfers as part of that. Very important obligations of states. I also would like to point out that this another very important part of the advisory opinion is the reference to stopping harm and making reparations, providing for reparations as very important for us. And here they're very clear that a breach by state of any obligations constitutes an international act entailing the responsibility of that state. And breaches are not just actual actions, but it also includes omissions. So it's not only what you do, but what you also fail to do. And part of that obligation is to make sure that you stop the wrongful actions, you provide assurances of guarantees of non-repetition and providing full reparation to injured states, which we also, of course, take to mean the people of the countries and the different nations. Another important part of this that I also drew my attention is that they are also talking about private actors. No, while they're talking about state obligations, they're also saying that the obligations of states include the obligation to regulate the activities of private actors as a matter of due diligence. So this means that a state may also be responsible for its failure to exercise regulatory due diligence and therefore share responsibility in the impacts of what private actors are doing and or failing to do in this case also as well. So I think at least I know that there are many other parts that will be emphasized by my colleagues in the panel, but this is the things that I think should be emphasized in terms of the content of the advisory opinion, and that we should be out there using this advisory opinion to further strengthen our work in campaigning for the many demands that have actually been part of our efforts all these many years. So the decision or the advisory opinion is coming at a very, very important time, especially because we know that we have very little time left to act urgently, and that we need to make sure that those most responsible should be doing their share of what must be fair, equitable climate actions from all governments and countries. Thanks, Rachita.
Thank you so much, Liddy. Very powerful highlights you pulled out of that advisory opinion. We'll now move on to our next panelist, Erica Lennon, who's a senior attorney in the Climate and Energy Program at the Center for International Environmental Law, and her work focuses on international climate governance, climate finance, carbon markets, and accountability, as well as the intersection of human rights and climate change. Erica, over to you.
Thanks so much, Ruchita, and to everyone who's been part of organizing this panel. And very good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all of you who are joining us and watching and participating. So I'm going to follow up and talk a bit about sort of what this ICJ advisory opinion means for legal responsibility for mitigation and related to sort of the target around making sure warming is no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. So first, what is this ICJ ruling? What does it really mean? And so I want to point out first that this is one of 3 advisory opinions that has been issued by an international tribunal and international court, along with the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, related to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and one earlier in July from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And all 3 are consistent across the board, talking about the responsibility states have to act on climate change and to prevent harm. And this really was what the ICJ issued here in its ruling really was a sweeping opinion, and that consistently rejected the arguments that big polluters had put forward in both their written submissions and in oral arguments. And I think that, those of us who have engaged for many years in international negotiations have heard over and over again. And it really, as Liddy mentioned, sort of pointed out the binding obligations that states have under a whole host of laws. I want to start with grounding us in the science, because obviously that underpins a lot of what needs to happen. And what the ICJ did here was, one, they recognized that the IPCC and the reports that the IPCC puts out is the best available science. That includes them recognizing things that the ICJ has said over the years, which means that they also recognize that 1.5 is not safe for everyone on this planet. And that really is the goal. And one of, I think, the critical things that the ICJ highlighted, and that's been highlighted in some of the other advisory opinions, and that, I think we all have known and been saying for years, is that we can't talk about 2 degrees. And they also mentioned that like they confirmed, the ICJ confirmed that 1.5 really is, and keeping temperature rise to no more than 1.5 really is the goal. And that includes being the goal of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. Because, and one of the things they noted was that this has been recognized by all the parties, and that this has been part of the decisions. And so that's really what, when you're looking at what states' obligations are and what they need to do for due diligence, that's what you should be measuring it against. And and so countries need to be acting in a manner that enables keeping temperature rise to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is obviously important when you're looking at what states' obligations, especially those of big polluters, largely in the global north, have to do in response to this, for the many of us. And but what it really did was, in addition to laying out the science, really clearly laid out what all of the legal responsibilities are. And so as Liddy mentioned, the court affirmed that states have responsibilities under a whole host of international laws, and that it is not limited just to the UNFCCC or the Paris Agreement, which some big polluters had argued, but it includes a number of other multilateral environmental agreements, the ozone treaties, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Convention on the Law of the Sea, and that these all contain obligations that relate to the climate crisis, as well as international human rights law and customary international law, which is also really important because one of the core principles of customary international law is that states have a duty and an obligation to prevent harm to people and to the environment, and that harm includes greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And like some states had tried to argue that that was not the type of sort of transboundary harm that this very fundamental principle of customary international law includes. And some said, no, it's just about, pollution across borders or just air pollution. And the court rejected those arguments, which is obviously critical for what it means states have to do. And they then confirmed that in order to address and to fulfill their duties, states have to act with due diligence, and it has to be stringent. So it's not enough to just do the bare minimum. You have to do what's in line with, as Liddy mentioned, your common but differentiated responsibilities. It has to take into account historic responsibility, which obviously the global north has. It has to take into account equity. And so that when courts and others are assessing whether states have done enough, they need to look at whether they've sort of fulfilled their due diligence requirements on a stringent basis. And this includes a duty to prevent harm, which obviously means mitigating and doing what you need to do to prevent the climate crisis in the first place. And to take all necessary actions that can help prevent the harm to people and planet, and to prevent human rights abuses. And so that entails a lot. And if states aren't doing that, then obviously they can be, or they can potentially be held accountable. On some very specific things sort of related to mitigation, which was one of the things I was going to highlight, is a few points that I think a number of us have also been saying throughout the years. So obviously the way that sort of the Paris Agreement is implemented is through the nationally determined contributions. And there's been a lot of arguing and a lot of people sort of saying, these are all nationally determined. It's up to our discretion. We get to do what we want. And the court said, no, that's not actually true. Your NDCs have to make, people's NDCs need to collectively be capable of achieving the goals of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. And that means achieving, in addition to the adaptation goal, but achieving and making sure that collectively they can keep us below 1.5. And no NDC synthesis report has ever said that we're on that path. And so what this means, and it needs to be done in light of sort of CBDR, taking into account historic responsibility. And so this means states don't actually have, it's not entirely discretionary. They not only have to represent the highest possible ambitions and be more demanding over time, and sort of take into account all of these, they need to be able to achieve that goal. And if they're not, that has consequences. And frankly, states should go back to the drawing board and do them again. Um, Critically, and I think, one of the things that is most important or that was really interesting was that the states also, or the court also directly addressed fossil fuels and pointed out that the production, consumption, licensing for exploration, and subsidizing fossil fuels could be an internationally wrongful act for which states could be held accountable. And so that means there's not just a free pass to polluters and to fossil fuel companies, but that really could be a wrongful act for which states could be held accountable. As Liddy mentioned, it also mentioned private entities and that states have to regulate private entities and they can be held responsible if these private entity actors fail to regulate and continue to emit and harm people and planet. It obviously also includes financing, as Liddy mentioned. And again, much like with the NDCs, the court pointed out that it's not just any financing. While the Paris Agreement doesn't say, X state has to provide this amount of finance, they did say the finance should be consistent with meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. And that means making sure we can meet the adaptation goal, making sure we can meet the mitigation goal to stay below 1.5. And obviously, that probably means more finance flowing from the global north and those most responsible to the global south. A few other things I'll just highlight is the court also, obviously recognized that it's not just under, as I mentioned, it's not just under the sort of climate treaties that states have obligations. It's also under customary international law and human rights law. As part of this, the court recognized that the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a precondition for the realization of other human rights. Earlier in the month, the Inter-American Court for Human Rights also noted that a safe climate was part and having a safe climate was part of the right to a healthy environment.
Erica,
And
sorry,
so,
2 minutes
yeah,
to wrap up. Thank you.
great. Thanks, Estefa. I will wrap up shortly. And just to say really quickly, if states violate any of their obligations, they can be held accountable and there can be remedy and reparations, which I will not go into because I know that Adrian coming after me will talk about it. And I think Mohammed will as well. And so just what this means really quickly is as we're going into states putting forward their NDCs, they have to be in line with achieving the 1.5 goal. And we can also take this advisory opinion and this ruling and this decisive statement on binding law on all countries, especially global north countries, and use it to hold them accountable. And that can happen through, litigation, but it can also happen in the upcoming negotiations and to really take the words that the ICJ wrote and translate that and point out what countries haven't been doing and need to be doing when we all gather for COPs or when they all gather for COPs every year to make more ambitious agreements and also to inform other agreements and things that are coming forward like the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty or the Plastics Treaty. And I will stop.
Thank you so much, Erica. I feel like this is such a teaser to like what all that we can discuss, because it's like we're just touching like the highlights, but there's so much that is there to unpack. So thank you so much for bringing all of that. We'll next move on to our third panelist, Adrian Martinez Blanco. MA is the director of La Ruta del Clima, a Costa Rican NGO and a member of DCJ that advocate for public participation in climate and environmental decision making and through UNFCCC, and they have been a member of UNFCCC since 2014. Adrian, can I just quickly ask you, are you planning to speak in English or Spanish? Then I can ask
I can speak in English. No,
Okay.
that'll be fine. So thank you everyone for joining. I think at least for many of us that have been working on loss and damage and advocating for reparations for many years, it feels very good to be right. So that's something that we have to appreciate, because in the climate world, it's seldomly justice and your rights are recognized. So that's very important. I think with the issue of reparations and loss and damage, well, the court acknowledges that emissions keep rising. So even though it clarifies that the stabilization of the emissions is the goal, it's not happening, and also the limits of adaptations has been reached in many cases, and loss and damage is increasing. So it also notices that the decisions that we take from 2020 to 2030 will last thousands of years, will have an effect in thousands of years. So we're talking a very significant decision making. And it also, I think it is also important to conceptualize that it is not only a legal approach what the decision is talking about, because at the end the court talks about that there is a limit to what the advisory opinion can do, but that there is a duty in terms of social and political actions that we have to take. And that's also very important in terms of loss and damage and reparations. As my colleague said, the court goes into very detail, not all of them, but highlights what are the obligations that are applicable to states in terms of results or duty to perform or conduct. And it goes into those, into adaptation, mitigation, and even so also in terms of the issue of the duty to cooperate. And this is very important. For example, it cites Article 9 in terms of finance. So there is a duty to cooperate, and that's also part of what can be the states held accountable. And this is important because that is the route that will lead us to responsibility, that will lead us to reparations. So if a state, as my colleague says, doesn't do or does something that it is an obligation to do according to the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol of the UNFCCC, and that violates their obligation to prevent harm to the environment, then we can start talking about attributing that into responsibility. Once we have responsibility, we can talk about how to find the cause of a harm. But there isn't a need for us to show that a state made harm to ask for them for responsibility. That is something very important, because we can, if we prove that there was an omission or an action that generated, that violated an obligation, we can ask them to stop and to do not repeat. And that might be, for example, to redo their NDCs or change a policy or change a law. And that is very important because the attribution also for reparations is a bit harder, but in terms of showing the causation of harm. But responsibility is something that we for sure have been paved the way to demand states in terms of what they're supposed to do and their duty to prevent or to cooperate in terms of the environment. So that is very important to know in terms of access to justice and modifying the governance of climate change and making it more accountable to states. In terms of responsibility, as my colleagues also mentioned, it is not only what states did or did not do, it's also what their companies did, and if they did not take the adequate supervision or regulations to stop them from violating or generating harm to the environment. So there is a connection between the private sector and where that private sector is based and who has control, legal control of those companies, which is very important because one of the major polluters that we have been dealing with and that have caused harm and has generated responsibility is the private sector. So that is another way that we can move forward into this discussion of justice. In terms of reparations, for example, the other thing that we have to show is that there is a relationship between their failure to prevent or their failure to cooperate and a specific harm that was caused, and that there is a linkages. That's the easy part of that is proving the science link, the attribution, but it's not about, and this is also a very important thing when we talk about attribution. In the UNFCCC, when we talk about attribution, we're talking just about the attribution of an event to climate change. What we're talking here about attribution, it is the action or inaction of a state towards their obligation. When we talk about causality, it's how that inaction of fulfilling their duties generating a harm. So that's the thing that we have to prove to get reparations. And the court says it's feasible. And in terms of human rights, for example, in the Inter-American Court advisory opinion, the burden of proof was inverse. So inverse because the human rights court recognizes the asymmetry of powers. So it is not unfeasible to argue that there is damage. And then if we ascertain that there is damage, we can ask for compensations, we can ask for satisfaction, we can ask for restoration and restitution, I'm sorry, and those things will lead also to justice. So we have two avenues to one, to ask for responsibility, which is a bit easier, and then also to ask for reparations or remedies to harm through those three avenues. And I think the other thing that it's very important that that court completely destroyed is the notion that we cannot ask for responsibility for loss and damage. The court says that paragraph 51, where it talks about liability and compensation not being able to be talked under article, says it should be understood that the states chose the duty to cooperate in terms of loss and damage. They did not exclude responsibility and therefore reparations from loss and damage. It's still applicable to it. So it's something that the states have two options. Either they cooperate to, for example, and it cites the fund to respond to loss and damage, they cooperate adequately to deal with the loss and damage and fulfill that obligation to cooperate, and also with all the other elements of Article 8, or they will then be responsible for not fulfilling the responsibility to cooperate adequately to prevent harm. And that is something that is there that can be also explored, but it's also the notion that countries could also avoid going to court because there is also already harm in terms of loss and damage, but they could choose to develop protocols or mechanisms that deal with the issue of harm in a way that is cooperative and that fits actual science and fits the scale. That is something that is not being done. For example, the loss and damage fund is nowhere near to respond to the actual harm that is being caused. So they're not cooperating adequately. So which other avenue then people have? It's litigation. That is something that probably countries and should think to avoid. And as the court says, it has to be a real effort beyond just litigation. And this is a question that we have for the UNFCCC in terms of loss and damage and reparations. With the existing mechanism, fit the scale for them to fulfill the duty to cooperate in Article 8, or should we just litigate in every single national court, human rights court, and eventually countries that are particularly injured will go to the ICJ and litigate? So it is an issue of how do we manage a real thing instead of avoiding it, which has been the approach in the last 30 years to loss and damage. Nobody wants to deal with it. The fund has no obligation, doesn't provide money. Even the Inter-American Court says it does not report to climate debt. So the tools that have been there that the states have this obligation to cooperate are not fulfilling or not up to the task of what loss and damage is to people, and therefore is not enabling them to avoid harm or to feel or to access this restitution of justice. So I think this is in general a very good idea or a very good position for civil society for COP30, because it let us rethink and reset how reparations have to come from the multilateral system, or if not, start organizing to take our rights into the courts and demand reparations from the loss and damage that we know has already happened and that the court itself has already recognized that is happening in white space across the world. And I think that idea that states have an obligation to repair, and that citizens and individuals, according to specific treaties such as human rights treaties or national courts, have a right to demand the harm to be repaired. So it is no longer a myth, and the court paves a way that is a bit complex, but that we can walk slowly but surely towards justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrian. I think that was really helpful, the way you unpacked how reparations play a role here, and then how reparations can be claimed based on the advisory opinion that has come out. We'll now move on to our last panelist. Please welcome Mohammed Adaw, who's the founder and director of Power Shift Africa, which he formed in 2018 to mobilize climate action in Africa and shift climate and energy policies to zero carbon. Go ahead, Mohammed.
Thank you, Ruchita. Colleagues, let's first recognize, the legal earthquake this ruling is, for the climate crisis. Our fight for justice, gained a mighty ally. The message from The Hague is unambiguous. Climate action is no longer, a gesture of goodwill. It is the law, as my colleagues have said. And so the era of impunity is ending. We now have the most powerful ally on the world's most authoritative, legal bench on our side. In the midst of escalating climate destruction across the world, and particularly, in poor developing countries who have stood at the moral epicenter of this crisis and have been bearing the brunt of the climate harm, despite, contributing barely a fraction of the global emissions, now have, the rule of law on their side. We have a very bold and historic ruling here. And the tides of, global climate accountability are finally shifting. For the first time, the ICJ has declared that government actions which fuel climate change are illegal under international law. So this ruling isn't merely a mere symbolism. It is, in fact, a seismic legal pronouncement that elevates, the Paris Agreement's 1.5-degree goal from aspiration to obligation. And I think this is something I just want to underline. That goal to limit global heating to below 1.5 degree is actually an obligation. It leaves no room for ambiguity. States, and by extension, and I think this is important, the companies within them have a binding duty to halt, climate pollution. And more importantly, in our case, in the developing world, repair the damage already inflicted on vulnerable countries. So this ruling affirms that, the failure to regulate emissions, to continue the production, the consumption, the subsidies that they continue to provide fossil fuels, or even the failure to curtail, corporate pollution, isn't just reckless. It constitutes an internationally wrongful act. And this is something for us to actually embrace and run with. Countries responsible for climate harm, those in the rich world who have contributed the bulk of the emissions that have caused climate change, who owe the rest a climate debt, whether it's mitigation debt because they've taken more than their fair share of the atmospheric space, who owe us an adaptation debt because we're now suffering, the harms from the emissions, and who owe us a loss and damage debt because some of the adverse impact now exceed our coping mechanisms. Face, now the spectra of legal consequences, including restitution, as you've just had, and reparations to states that are already suffering. We now have an important ruling that holds them to the harms that they've caused and requires them to both provide restitution and reparations. And so this is very crucial for developing countries, and particularly the vulnerable countries, where climate-linked drought, floods, food insecurity are not abstract dangers, but daily realities that we're dealing with. The ruling clarifies, that human rights, access to food, access to water, shelter, dignity, are inseparably linked to environmental protection. And these rights are not just for the present. They extend also to future generations, our youth, whose future hangs in the balance. So our governments must now seize this moment. The ICJ ruling is more than a legal tool. It's a political leverage. It empowers developing countries to demand justice through international negotiations and, more importantly now, courtroom challenges. No longer can big emitters now hide behind, their nationally determined contributions, these bottom-up NDCs. The court made clear, ambition that adds up to get the job done to hold heating to below 1.5 degree is not optional. For years, those of us who have been following the multilateral climate negotiations will know that many of these actors, particularly the rich world, have hidden behind, flimsy interpretations of the Paris Agreement, treating climate commitments as loose guidelines rather than binding responsibilities. They've, over time, undermined, the Climate Convention, the UNFCCC, and, the balance of responsibilities that was struck in 1992. The court has now firmly dispelled that illusion. It confirmed that the climate crisis implicates not just environmental treaties, but also core principles of international human rights law. That means, even countries not party to the UN climate framework are still obligated to act. And I'm here looking at the US that have withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. And so we must now mobilize this precedent in every forum, from the UN Climate Summit to domestic litigation, so that we can be able to ensure the legal clarity transforms into, urgent political action. Moreover, the ruling solidifies, the protection for climate displaced people, and affirms that, small island nations threatened by sea level rise will not lose their legal identity. This strengthens our solidarity, our global solidarity with our oceanic, cousins, and brings hope to millions displaced by worsening climate impacts. I'm calling in from Africa, my home continent, where a good number of our people are now being displaced, forcefully being displaced by extreme weather events. And now we have the legal clarity, and this must ignite moral clarity, I must say. For too long, the climate diplomacy has been riddled with delays, deflections, and deeply unequal compromises. If you guys remember, every time we have a final decision, it's mostly been a compromise, and mostly one that reflects the lowest common denominator, which effectively undermines ambition. So this ICJ's verdict calls for a rewriting of that playbook. It empowers us and all frontline nations to demand not just financial assistance, but true climate justice. What does that mean? It means reparations for loss and damage. It means guarantees for non-repetition, and also binding, accountability for polluters. Our climate movement now stands at crossroads, armed with both law and legitimacy. So the next chapter must be one of assertive leadership and wuthering advocacy, and a vision that is rooted not just in survival, but in justice and renewal. For too long, those that have been led by the environmental imperative to cut emissions have discounted what we call climate justice, what we call fairness, one that is rooted in the principles of the UN Climate Convention that recognizes those with historic responsibility and the greatest financial and technological wherewithal should bear the greatest burden. So let's remember this landmark opinion, is one that helps to correct that and affords us an opportunity to make now a stronger case, both in the formal climate negotiations, but also through litigation for reparation, and for us to actually correct the historic wrongs. I want to end by remembering, the genesis of this, landmark opinion. It stems from an inspiring grassroots genesis, a group of law students from the Pacific Islands, who dared to ask the world highest court a question that has echoed for decades. Should countries be legally held accountable for the harm they cause through climate inaction and fossil fuel dependence? That their question led to this definitive judgment is a triumph of youth-led advocacy and underscores the outsized impact of small island voices in the global discourse. So this isn't just a victory for the Pacific. It is a triumph for all developing countries, for all the justice-seeking people of this planet. To the young people and to the young Pacific students who lit this torch, I must say thank you. Thank you for your courage and for your leadership. Your courage has given us and the world a new path forward. Now it's up to us to walk that And I think it's an opportunity we must seize so that we can be able to truly deliver justice, one that clarifies that the rights that we all have, whether it's for a safe climate, access to food, water, shelter, dignity, those things are inseparably linked to environmental protection. And that those who have polluted and have caused the bulk of the emissions actually bear a responsibility, and we can actually hold them accountable. That is a legal earthquake. This opinion is, and our fight now has gained a very mighty ally, which we must actually utilize. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Like someone said in the chat, you really nailed it. So we already have some questions that have come into our QA box, and I see that some of our panelists have already answered some of them. So maybe I can just call out the ones that have not been answered. So there's a question by John Swad. And before that, can I just say it would be helpful if people can just add their questions directly in the QA box or chat. I don't think we have space to call on the people who have raised their hands. So we want to prioritize first these first, and then if there's space, we can definitely like call on people who have raised hands. So there's a question by John Swart. I would be interested in what Liddy and Erica feel are the implications of ICJ ruling for IFIs, and here I assume IFIs means international financial institutions. Obviously, states are owners of IFIs, but bringing legal challenges to address the past harms that IFI lending has caused to affected communities has proven difficult, for example. Yeah, so maybe who would like to take that, Liddy or Erica?
Yeah, well, both of us maybe. I think the statement about the responsibility of states to regulate private actors is very telling, that they even have bigger responsibility to regulate and watch and monitor and be accountable to what public institutions are doing. And IFIs are public institutions because the states are the owners of the IFIs. So if states are responsible for private actors, there are even bigger responsibility for the acts of IFIs. So I think that is something that we need to remember when we are engaging and challenging the IFIs, not just for the current policies, but IMF and World Bank, they've been around 80 years. So it's been 80 years of harm, and past, present, and continuing harm. Certainly they must be held accountable. I know, for instance, that there's been a lot of work being done to challenge the immunity clauses that govern the IFIs, but states can be held responsible for what the IFIs are doing.
Thank you so much, Liddy. Erica, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, just to pick up on what Liddy said. Yeah, I mean, I also think that one of the things that this makes clear is that states have a whole host of responsibilities to act to prevent harm, and to prevent harm to human rights, to prevent harm to people, to prevent harm to the planet, to prevent harm to the climate. And those don't go away just because you walk into the World Bank and take a vote. States still have those obligations. And so I think acting against those obligations is obviously a problem. The court was very clear, as Liddy said, on corporations, as well as on that acts related to subsidizing wrongful acts, or can be wrongful acts, or acts to subsidize fossil fuels or things that prevent harm or create harm, can still be wrongful acts. And so I think all of that can attempt to be used, I think, for policy advocacy and things like that. And then, yeah, there's still obviously a problem of immunity, but I do think that using these arguments and taking them in all forums can help. And to use this and to bolster arguments that we've been making at IFIs and other places can only help. Sorry, it's not totally concrete.
No, thank you so much, Erica, for taking that on. I see that Adrian has really taken on and answered some of the questions very concretely. Thank you so much, Adrian, for doing that. So maybe I can just take the question that has come in the chat right now. How the decision can contribute to fulfilling the so-called gap in addressing cross-border climate change induced human mobility. So I assume this means like climate, like refugees and migration due to the ongoing climate crisis. So how does the decision contribute to address this gap? Anyone who would be interested in taking on that question?
I can do it.
Yeah.
I think when we talk about when we think about human mobility, we have to do it in a dual way, in the right to remain and the right to move across borders and also within a state. So it comes down for people to be able to have the resources and have the conditions, for example, to have their ecosystem and land restored, which is the first measure of reparations. And if they cannot, then to be compensated for them to deal with the harm that has been unjustly caused. And that is pretty much talking or dealing with the core nexus of why people move from their homes. And it's also in the premises that nobody wants to leave their homes because they're happy there. And at least in my experience working in Central America, nobody wants to go anywhere. They don't know to live with people they never met, and they're usually very comfortable with their family and very happy in their beach or in their mountain. So it's all about preventing harm. And if you did harm them, because it has already happened in thousands of communities across the world, then you have to deal with the responsibility of repairing the harm. So that is how you deal. And if you don't, then it's also related with the obligations of adaptation in terms of human mobility. You have to provide secure legal pathway for people to cross borders or move within a country to secure their human rights, because what the court is also saying is that their human rights have been violated and that they can go and claim those in the courts according to the different treaties applicable.
Thank you
Can
so
I
much.
quickly add?
Yes, Mohammed, go ahead.
Yeah. So there's this thing called climate-induced migration, which the historic polluter who've caused the climate crisis now look at as a security issue. So those in the rich world that have caused this crisis tend to look at it as a security issue rather than as forced climate migration, which is actually a humanitarian disaster. We're seeing people lose their lives, homes, livelihoods, with repercussions on communities where they actually move from. This is why I think the response to climate migration needs to be more people-centered and focused on the victims, and not to treat them as security problem that needs to be solved. Because when you look at the rich world, they look at it as a security problem that needs to be solved. I think climate change is the biggest moral, question of our time. No issue more clearly demonstrates on a global scale the suffering of those of us in the global south due to the actions of these big polluters of the rich world than migration. That is why at the heart of the climate crisis and why we need a solution that is just and addresses these issues rather than trying to avoid them. And so we now have an important lever that we can actually use, one that is actually going to put people and their interest, including their livelihood, at the center. So this is another opportunity for us as we demand reparation and restitution for us to actually try and extract the climate-induced migration from the security hands into what it is, which is forced displacement, and the importance of actually looking at it as an adaptation issue, because people are actually being forced out of their land, and also as a loss and damage issue, and be able to provide people the requisite support that they require.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. So I see that Aiden had also answered one of the pending questions, but maybe like based on some of the questions that have come in and also the recent question from Sophia on what to expect on groups now mobilizing, trying to counter or prevent anything about this of this advisory opinion from moving forward. So maybe I can just combine a bunch of these questions to ask like what are the expectations on the next steps, perhaps, like when it comes to strategies for the movement, for the governments. I know Mohammed already answered some of that on how the governments can use this, but if maybe each panelist can take a minute to reflect on now how to take this forward, what are the next steps or strategies that movements and groups can move forward and mobilize around. And so can we start with, again, the order of the panelists, like Liddy, Erica, Adrian, and then Mohammed. And just a minute because we're also at the end of it nearly.
Yeah, so of course it goes without saying, one of the immediate things we can do is when we argue our demands in various spaces and arenas, one of a strong basis for arguing the demands is now being provided for by the advisory opinion. But what I'm interested also to explore is whether litigation moving forward can be done on the basis of this advisory opinion. So maybe Erica has more ideas on this front, but certainly given this advisory opinion, it provides us with a lot more confidence in exploring litigation. And there have been several important victories in litigation. I see Patrick has mentioned in the Q&A about the current victory now in South Africa. I think that just happened today, right, Patrick? And so whether we can, we or maybe our southern governments as a collective or several governments together, whoever has the legal standing to pursue litigation in national courts as well as in international courts or in the ICJ itself on the basis of this opinion. And I think that would be an exciting thing because, you know, as we have many instruments, but this is one of the areas I think that is also exciting to explore.
Thank you so much, Liddy. Erica?
Yeah, so I think a couple things. One, you know, of course, you know, big polluting and skeptical governments will probably come in with the same arguments. It's important to remember they all asked for this and they all participated in this. So they clearly recognize the authority of the ICJ and the ICJ to do this. And so ignoring this is at their own peril. It will hurt the whole world, including the people in their countries. It will put them on the wrong side of history, and they will probably find themselves in court. And I think, you know, over the last few years, we've seen a rising tide of climate litigation over and over again. And this opinion can only be used to bolster that. You know, we've seen advisory opinions in the past or opinions from the ICJ. They can be used not only by states bringing claims against states in the ICJ, but also can be used at national level, at regional courts to bolster all of the arguments and to say, you know, this is what the law is. And I think what this really proved is that the law is on our side. The law is what we've said it is. Justice is on our side. And the highest court in the land has said that. And this is proven also, as Mohammed pointed out at the end of his presentation, what the power of initially students in a law school class did to come up with and develop this question and to bring it to the world's highest court and have the court say, yes, states have an obligation, and that obligation is to prevent harm. And so we need, you know, more of that, what at the time was radical thinking, to sort of bring it. And I would say, you know, bring this up in, you know, yes, more lawsuits, but also bring it up in negotiations, whether that's at COP30 in Brazil, whether that's at the plastic treaty negotiations ongoing now, and other spaces, and really emphasize it's not just what we've said, it's what the highest court in the land has said their obligations are, and they need to act in accordance with those.
Thank you so much, Erica. Adrian?
Yes, very quickly. I think for us in going into the next years and in COP, it's about resetting and reforming the processes for them to fit the minimum that is the legal understanding of what are country obligations. And then from our work is for communities to be able to demand for the harm to be stopped. And if that means to start taking measures such as reparations for that harm to become real, either monetarily, legally, morally, into the existence of the global north, that is something that we have to take forward either in litigation, but also within the UNFCCC. And this is something that we know many countries and delegates do not acknowledge, that their obligation to deal with loss and damage and their obligation not to harm and to repair the harm. And that is something that we will work on.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Mohammed, last words, please.
I think this legal clarity that this opinion has provided us must actually ignite moral clarity. It must give us the momentum to put, you know, the issue of justice at the heart of the discussions, whether it's the UNFCCC, whether it's a treaty negotiation, the plastic treaty negotiations, so that we can be able to tackle these environmental harms effectively in a manner that actually protects justice. I think there are three things that are critical. One is those that have actually polluted the most must cut their emissions and also lead the world towards a low carbon resilient future. To be able to do that, they must be able to share the finance, the technology, and the other associated support that is required by the developing countries. And so here is an obligation to provide those resources so that we can be able to help contribute to solve a problem that we didn't create in the first place. So the developed world, or rather the rich world, have the world's most wealth. And that wealth was in part created by polluting, where the rest of us have subsidized their development. And that is actually something we need to call on. And this decision, this opinion gives us actually all the justification and the evidence we require that to be able to tackle climate injustice, we need the rich world to lead by cutting emissions, by sharing resources. And we must use that now to forge a different playbook than the one we have, one that actually helps to operationalize that very important UNFCCC principle of common but differentiated responsibility, and set out a plan that is based on each country's historic responsibility and capacity to respond. I think this opinion has laid out the basis for us to forge that plan. And that vision must now help us bridge the gap between the current business as usual path we've been on and what is needed to effectively tackle the climate crisis. And that is an opportunity we must all seize.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. I want to thank our panelists for taking our time to at least walk us very initially through what this advisory opinion means for us on the ground for the climate justice movement, but also for the entire world. This has been, like a lot of people have expressed, a very, very insightful conversation and clearly indicative that more conversations need to happen to continue unpacking this and explore and strengthen, and as Mohammed just said in his last words, to also reshape, what our advocacy looks like now moving forward. I'll pass it on to now Esthapan to close it off for us. Thank you so much, panelists.
Thank you, Rachita, for the wonderful moderation, and of course to our panelists and to the audiences who have stayed beyond time, who have attended in huge numbers. The co-hosts TCJ, LNTC, La Ruta, Third World Network, Power Shift Africa, SEAL, APMDD, and Corporate Accountability. Thank you. Please follow our socials to know more about this conversation. There is also an agenda doc that is placed in the comments. You can read presentations from the panelists over there and some other resources. Thank you, everyone. We really thank you from all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.